Hello, BookTube. Well, it's Monday, and I wanted to talk about a book that I read over the weekend, and that's Jim Thompson, The Getaway. I read this book because I'm participating in Randy Ray's The Lone Star Book Club this year, which I'm really excited about. Next month, we'll be reading Shakespeare's sonnets, which I think is great. I love the eclectic mix of books on his lists, and so that's why I decided to participate. So it was Jim Thompson this month, Shakespeare next month, which is great. So this will be the first video that I upload talking about a book in its own standalone video, so forgive me if I'm a little green at doing that. But generally speaking, I just want to talk about my experience with books, my personal reactions to them, what I liked about them and what I didn't like about them. But they're not going to be like reviews in any formal capacity. It's just going to be kind of my own personal experience with the books that I'm reading. In this case, The Getaway is a piece of crime fiction, and I don't read a lot of crime fiction. In fact, I was consulting my bookshelf and looking at books that I've read in the past that could fit that category and that this book reminded me of. So I have a couple of here. Obviously, I have The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler. I have this one, Black Wings Has My Angel, and then this one, Hard Rain Falling, by Don Carpenter. There's just being three pieces of noir crime fiction that I remember reading, but unfortunately all three of those share the distinction of being books that I didn't like really reading at all. The last one that I read was this one, Black Wings Has My Angel, and after reading that and realizing that I didn't like it, I basically put a nail in the whole genre and decided not to keep reading it and just double down on the things that I knew I liked reading. So this is the first piece of crime fiction that I've read in a while. But I actually really enjoyed it, and I liked it more than any of the three novels that I mentioned previous. I thought that this novel did something really interesting, which is the way that it ended. Now, a lot of people talk about that ending as well. It is the most interesting and distinctive feature of the novel. Prior to the last chapter of the book, it's a very standard piece of crime fiction. You have a main character who's really cool. And he doesn't miss except for when he does, and he always knows how to get out of a situation except for when he doesn't. And he has a wife, and she's pretty. And that's pretty much all there is to her. And they do various bad criminal things. They rob, they steal, they double cross, they murder, they get in, cars and drive away and, things like that. Very, very typical crime fiction stuff. Now, as far as those elements are concerned, I have not read a million crime novels, so maybe this is superlative. Maybe it's unique amongst crime novels as being the best of the best. I have a very strong hunch that it isn't, but it's also not bad in any way. It's just normal. By the numbers. Pretty typical. Not anything very unique. Which, if you like that kind of thing, is great. Personally, I could take it or leave it. Most of the time, I leave it. But in this case, the novel does get to a point in its final chapter where it abandons all of that. And now all of a sudden it becomes some sort of surrealist nightmare, which I wasn't expecting. Although I do have to say that I was warned ahead of time that the novel was going to take a turn in the last chapter, so I knew that that was going to happen, and even still, I was surprised by it. My initial reaction to it was negative. I was reading it, and I was like, what the hell is going on? I knew that it was going to end strangely, but this is not... I didn't know what to expect, but certainly at the very start of the chapter, it's a completely different book all of a sudden. It's as if you are in a nightmare. There are things that just don't quite make sense about it, and you don't know exactly where you are or what's happening, and it really kind of throws you off center. But after I finished it and I was looking back over it and then I was thinking over it and then I watched actually Randy Ray's video from I think a year back where he talked about the book, it really did all click and I found myself really appreciating the way that it ended. Part of the reason that I appreciated the way that it ended was because it did remind me of the fact that I was reading a novel, which I really like. I like movies that remind me that I'm watching a movie. I'm not saying that it has to be meta, that it has to be like Deadpool or something like that, and he's breaking the fourth wall. I mean, when I watch like a Charlie Kaufman movie, and something like Eternal Sunshine of a Spotless Mind, and a car just falls out of the sky, and within the context and logic of the movie, it makes sense. But at the same time, it also is kind of winking at you that this is cool because you're watching a movie. This is something that's unique because you're watching a movie. Obviously, this isn't going to literally happen, but you're watching a movie, so who cares? That it can, you know what I mean? It's the same thing with like the end of Moby Dick, where like Ahab becomes almost like a fire god. he's enveloped in flames, and he's saying these incantations, and it's insane, and it's awesome. It's incredible. And this reminded me of that in a way. It also reminded me of an episode of The Twilight Zone. Because what an episode of The Twilight Zone typically did was it would set up a very weird situation for you to be in, or a very tense situation, a strange situation that you don't know how to extricate yourself from, and you don't know exactly what's going on as somebody watching somebody in this situation, I mean. But you think you know the parameters and the rules. There are certain things, you know where the world begins and where the world ends, and you're trying to figure out what's going on within those parameters. But it turns out that the answer to the riddle, or the answer to the situation that you're in, is outside of that. All of a sudden it turns out, well, it's all in a person's head, let's say. It's all a dream, or it's an experiment that's being run on them, or it's a set, and they're being watched and observed by somebody else. Then all of a sudden, that is the explanation. But the point is that the story is different than you thought it was. Now all of a sudden that last reveal reframes the entire thing that you've seen. And I would say that the last chapter of this book does something very similar, at least in my experience with reading it, where now all of a sudden that last chapter is reframing everything that came before it. Not in the sense that it's a totally different novel, or that the events of the novel are somehow different, because of course they aren't. They're unchanged. But now all of a sudden it's like you're watching it from a completely different angle. You didn't realize as you were reading the book that this book was at the edge of reality, and that at the very end they kind of break through reality. They get on this boat, and this boat leads them outside of the regular world. And now all of a sudden they're in some upside down hellscape. And that was never in your mind, at least reading it prior to that, a possibility. It was like death, jail, escape. Those are kind of the three outcomes. They're either going to die, they're either going to get caught, or they're either going to escape. And what's really interesting is that this ending allows you to kind of have your cake and eat it too, because in a way, all three endings happen at the same time, which is really interesting. On the one hand, they get away, and in fact, in a very ironic way, they celebrate that at the end. On the one hand, they get caught, because they end up in a place that is actively worse than any prison that Doc McCoy has been in prior to where he finds himself at the end of the novel. And then also they are sentenced to death because death is assured. They're either going to kill each other or they're going to get an even worse fate, which I guess I won't say. But there is no good option for them. So in a weird way, all three realities happen at once. And I thought that was really, really interesting. I thought that was really, really cool. And again, it is almost meta in a way, because it does remind you of the fact that you are reading a book. At the same time, I don't necessarily want to say it doesn't stick the landing, because I think it does. But it doesn't feel like, as a novel, this is a great achievement in literature. And the reason for that is that it feels more like an interesting thought that you have to experience by reading the book, and I appreciate that. But at the same time, it's not some sort of, grand achievement in the sense that it does feel like it was kind of dashed off. Like this was written quickly, and it almost feels like Jim Thompson, who apparently, and I've never read Jim Thompson before, and again, this is the first time I'm hearing of Jim Thompson, so forgive me if I'm mischaracterizing him or whatever, but he is a person who's written several or many pieces of crime fiction, and it almost feels like he was fatigued by the end of the book with his own creations and with the own limitations of his genre. And so he decided to do, like a Twilight episode, just flip it on its head and say, well, look, this ending, or where this is going, is something that you'd never expect because I'm breaking the rules. And now all of a sudden these characters are outside of the strictly defined reality that everyone else, including Jim Thompson typically, is constrained by. Now all of a sudden they're in this, hellish nightmare, because why not? Why couldn't you put them in a hellish nightmare? So I think it's really interesting. And I certainly appreciate the recommendation to read it. So, we're off to a great start as far as the book club is concerned. So I'm excited to keep going. I don't necessarily know if I'm going to read any more of Jim Thompson. If it comes up in the course of reading, I will definitely do that. He has works that are more popular than this, I think. And he also has works that might be better realized. I don't know. I'll have to experience them for myself to be able to judge that. But I definitely had a pleasant experience with this book. I also have to say that a big point in its favor for me is that it's quite short. I read it in a day, which I think that's important for crime fiction in a way, just because these are very plot-heavy books, so you're not necessarily in a situation where you want to live with these characters for a long time, like you would in, like a Tolstoy novel or something like that. It's more of like, okay, they're in this weird situation. How are they going to get out of it? And then, okay, now they're in this weird situation. How are they going to get out of it? So you do that, and that's great, but it can overstay its welcome pretty quickly, which is what I feel like happens in some of the other aforementioned books that I didn't like nearly as much. So it's short, it's tight, it doesn't feel like it's imposing on you, and again, it's building toward a climax that I didn't see coming, but that I really liked and reframed the whole story. So that's it. I think that's all I want to say about that. I recommend it. And I think that it's a fun book, and I think it's not very fun in the sense that it's kind of pessimistic and nihilistic, but at the same time, it's fun because it does something that you wouldn't expect, and that can be fun. Getting your expectations turned on their head it can be a pleasurable thing when you realize that it was done with an intention, and I genuinely feel like it was, because again I feel like Jim Thompson in creating this sort of surrealist nightmare of an ending was able to somehow simultaneously get every ending to a crime novel summed up in one kind of crazy way. So very interesting, very cool, and I'll leave it there. Thank you, BookTube.